Look at this, I'm like a real YouTuber now. I have purple lighting. All the rage. 5 years ago. Also, take note of the nacho earrings I'm wearing for this video. Just saying. So, as you may or may not know, Beavis and Butthead has recently come back in the form of a new season and a movie, Beavis and Butthead Do the Universe. So naturally, I went and watched every episode of Beavis and Butthead ever produced. And you know me, I love to overthink things. Beavis and Butthead certainly seem like incredibly simple characters on the surface, but once you watch their various adventures, see them deal with all kinds of different situations, and interact with different characters, you quickly realize they aren't quite as simple as they appear. That's why I want to explore their personalities and what makes these characters who they are. I have watched every episode of the original series, the 2011 reboot, the 2022 reboot, both movies, read all the comic books, and I've even read all of the supplemental books that I could get my hands on. This is the psychology of Beavis and Butthead. Beavis and Butthead are dumb. There's no doubt about that. But they are a very specific kind of dumb. They blissfully wander through life rolling with whatever it is that is happening in the moment. They are also the type of characters who misinterpret situations and jump to wild conclusions, seamlessly going along with whatever they happen to believe in the moment. Both boys have issues with anger and aggression, which manifest themselves in different ways in either of them. Butthead always seems like he's just slightly annoyed, and it takes very little to set him off. But even then, his reaction is usually nothing more than a sharp verbal response or a quick smack upside the head. Beavis, on the other hand, bottles up his frustration and lets it build and build until eventually he explodes. This takes the form of hyper-crazed rants and sometimes fantasies about killing or maiming those who have wronged him. In the episode Murder Site, Beavis gets increasingly irritated with Butthead calling him a butt knocker.
Butt knocker?
Damn it, Butthead, stop calling me butt knocker!
Now, fart knocker, butt munch, butt wagon, those are all fine. But butt knocker? That's just going too far. And of course, no matter how many times he tells Butthead to stop, he keeps on doing it. And eventually, Beavis snaps and attempts to murder Butthead. And Butthead doesn't really care that his best friend is trying to kill him. Butthead is violent in the sense that he acts on impulse in the moment. He uses it as a way to immediately release that emotion, or other times it's simply pragmatic. Non-emotional, just used as a way to snap Beavis back to reality. Beavis is somebody who is very much removed from reality, at least partially. He always has one foot in his own little world, and that world of his is a violent place full of explosions, fire, and death. Beavis and Butthead have this sort of childlike, one-track way of thinking. This sort of immediate pursuit of whatever they want in that moment. If they're hungry, if they're bored, if they have a sexual urge, that's all they think about, and they will set out to immediately satisfy that desire. They don't have any ability to think beyond that or to plan ahead. For example, to buy food and save it because they'll inevitably be hungry again tomorrow. That would never occur to them because once they've satisfied that craving, they move on to something else. Similarly, they lack the ability to assess cause and effect. They do not understand the potential consequences of their actions, aside from the really basic stuff. Butthead can't foresee that if he punches Beavis in the nose, it could bleed, that if he crawls into a pipe, he could get stuck, if they electrocute themselves, they could die, if Beavis sticks his finger in a table saw, he could cut his finger off. Even the concept of pain for them is really only understood in this very primal way. In that example I just gave with the table saw, Beavis is constantly oscillating between screaming in pain and being amused by the injury, which happens quite often. They don't learn from their pain to avoid those situations, and more importantly, they can't empathize with other people. They can't use their own experiences with pain to understand what someone else is feeling when they're hurt. They're usually just amused by the spectacle of it, or they're bored by it. But again, if it wasn't for that physical sensation, they wouldn't even care about their own injuries. In the episode Werewolves of Highland, they mistake a homeless man for a werewolf and ask him to bite them. They both wind up very sick, having contracted a bunch of diseases from him. They wallow in pain and suffering, never attempting to seek any sort of medical attention because they just assume they're werewolves and this is just what it feels like to be a werewolf. There's also the recent episode The Good Deed, in which Beavis and Butthead drink glass after glass of DDT, mistaking it for Spanish fly. Again, rather than recognize any of the adverse effects they're experiencing, they just keep forcing it down. Beavis and Butthead experience emotions much in the same way they experience their basic wants and needs, totally in the moment and without thought. I'm happy, I'm bored, I'm angry, I'm sad. And that's it. Just like with their impulses, they are slaves to their emotions with no ability to cover them up or control them. But we'll talk more about that in a minute. After all, what is the most important aspect of the show but Beavis and Butthead's relationship to one another? Beavis and Butthead certainly have an interesting friendship. Roger Ebert once said that Beavis and Butthead are one personality split between two characters in his review of Beavis and Butthead Do America. I don't think that's an entirely fair assessment, though they do have a lot of similarities. Beavis and Butthead have pretty much all the same interests, are both easily amused, they're both slackers. Butthead is obviously the more socially dominant of the two. Beavis, of course, has his moments where he goes completely off the wall, either from sugar, caffeine, or just getting excited. Butthead never gets that revved up. But still, it's not hard for a viewer tuning in to any random episode to easily be able to tell why Beavis and Butthead are friends. So we know why they hang out, but do they actually care about each other? And in order to answer that question, we first have to answer the question, do they even remotely like each other? I'm sure your first instinct is probably to say no.
Do you not care a rat's ass for the safety of your closest companion?
No.
But I don't think that's true. Beavis and Butthead certainly like being around each other. They get instantly bored when they aren't.
Well, this sucks. Hey, Beavis. Wait up.
And for as much as they may insult each other, they also compliment each other.
You're pretty cool, Beavis. This is cool.
You're pretty cool, Beavis.
Do it, brother Beavis.
They each think the other is cool. Butthead is endlessly amused by Beavis's antics. I think it's safe to say that despite their sophomoric fights, they do, in fact, like each other. But do they care about each other? Again, I think anyone's first instinct would be to say no. After all, they don't help each other when they're in danger or pain. Butthead hits Beavis, they don't care if the other dies. In the episode Blood Pressure, Beavis gets his arm caught in a blood pressure cuff. He's in excruciating pain, which Butthead only makes worse. But he is trying to help. It's just that Butthead doesn't understand that Beavis could never come out the way he's pulling him, and he isn't able to read the emergency release button. In the episode Choke, Butthead is choking on a piece of chicken. Beavis needs to be convinced for a good while before even attempting to help. But Beavis doesn't even understand the full implications of choking. When he does eventually try to help, he isn't taking his time because he wants Butthead to suffer, but because he doesn't understand the need for urgency and because he keeps getting distracted. Remember, Beavis and Butthead aren't capable of empathizing or even really realizing the pain of another person. They cannot make the connection between their own suffering and someone else's. This is why many episodes end with one of them getting into the exact same predicament they just witnessed the other suffering in, or even one they just suffered through themselves. The episode Nosebleed is similar. Butthead is actually trying to help, but he mistakes other cures, such as cures for hiccups or choking, as solutions to Beavis's nosebleed. Oftentimes, their mistakes are born from genuinely trying to help. Then, of course, there's the issue of Butthead hitting Beavis. If you go back and watch the original series, it's actually kind of rare that this would happen. There are 10, 15 episode stretches where it doesn't happen at all. It's something that's definitely been amped up in the new series, but even then, there's really only a few episodes where it's really egregious. But it's something that unfortunately has made a lot of people dislike Butthead as a character, and there are a few things you really have to take into consideration here. First of all, Beavis is not by any means a nice person, and he doesn't exactly treat Butthead any better than Butthead treats him. He just doesn't have the upper hand as often. Beavis will jump at the opportunity to get into a physical confrontation with Butthead, and let's not forget one of his signature moves was kicking Butthead in the nads when he pissed him off. In Beavis and Butthead Do the Universe, the boys get into a fight and briefly break up. While they are walking around in the rain, crying over how much they miss each other, they keep looking at things that remind them of their friendship. For Butthead, it is seeing a kid slapping his brother in the face, and for Beavis, it's seeing a guy kick another guy in the balls, clearly referencing their preferred attacks on each other. Beavis will also go out of his way to intentionally annoy Butthead. For as much of an example as Murder Site is, where Butthead annoyed Beavis to the point of nearly being killed by him, Beavis did the same thing. In the episode Follow Me, Beavis relentlessly copies Butthead just to irritate him, to the point that they both end up being hit by cars. So, while it's true that Butthead is by no means what you would call a nice person, neither is Beavis. Beavis just as much enjoys tormenting people and laughing at the misery of others. It's also important to contextualize their relationship to each other with their relationships to other characters. For example, Todd. He is nothing but cruel to them, but every time he hurts them, Butthead interprets it as a sign of affection. So the fact that Butthead seeks out this exact type of treatment for himself is kind of an important factor here. In the episode Nice Butthead, Butthead is put on a medication that suppresses his aggression. He becomes ultra mellow, accommodating, and polite. He starts treating Beavis like a genuine friend and tells him he would never hurt him. Beavis can't stand it. He is extremely off-put and annoyed by this version of Butthead. By the end of the episode, Beavis gets so frustrated with this nice version of his best friend that he attacks Butthead and forces him to puke up the medication. Butthead, with all of the aggression that was being suppressed, slams Beavis's head into the wall, and Beavis loves it. Look at him, he couldn't be happier. And this is consistent with older episodes. Beavis likes Butthead, and he likes him because he's bad, not despite of it. He's fun when he's himself, and he sucks when he's not. In another episode, It's a Miserable Life, an angel shows Butthead what the world would be like if he was never born. Beavis is best friends with Stuart, feeding the homeless in a soup kitchen. A lot of people say, oh, this is just proof Beavis would be such a better person if it wasn't for Butthead. But really, all that's happening here is that Beavis found someone else to follow around. And besides, Beavis is like 10 times happier after only a few seconds of Butthead's influence. And Butthead just wants Beavis back, figuring the world sucks just a little less with the two of them together. And now that whole, oh, they don't care if the other dies thing. Well, I think I can demonstrate that Beavis and Butthead don't really have a very good grasp on the concept of death. In issue 2 of the comic books, they have a long discussion about whether or not they will ever die. And, of course, there's this moment in the episode, Going Down.
But before I eat your leg, I'm gonna have to kill you.
Okay, but I get to kill you next because I'm hungry too.
There's also a ton of other examples, mainly during music video segments, where Beavis and Butthead express the sentiment that they don't really get that death is a permanent thing.
Whenever you see that dude, it means you're like gonna die.
Hey, Butthead, does that mean we're gonna die?
Yeah. Cool.
Yeah, this is gonna be cool. I'm like gonna die of starvation and stuff. Yeah, that might be cool.
I also want to mention the episode The Final Judgment of Beavis. In it, we see Butthead kind of callously burying Beavis's body in the backyard when he dies. But the episode turns out to be a dream, and in reality, Butthead was actually trying to wake Beavis up. In a very unconventional way, and certainly lacking in any sort of introspection or self-awareness, but ultimately, they do care about each other. But besides just their relationship to each other, there are some other important relationships we have to analyze. Todd is an older, low-life criminal that both Beavis and Butthead worship, and even that is probably an understatement. He was introduced in the episode The Crush, where we see that Beavis and Butthead are so completely infatuated with him, they will do anything he says, and as stated above, interpret all of his physical and verbal abuse towards them as signs of affection. Todd obviously represents a lot of hyper-masculine stereotypes they themselves would like to live up to, as well as this rebellious, counterculture, anti-authoritarian lifestyle they fashion themselves after. But there's also a few other things going on. Beavis and Butthead, being fatherless, are seeking the approval of an adult male authority figure. Todd is someone they have slotted into that role and go to extreme lengths to try to impress. Now, if there's anyone in the Beavis and Butthead verse that actually genuinely cares about the boys, it's Van Driesen. But of course they have no respect for David Van Driesen because he's so totally removed from anything they would consider cool. He's emotional, patient, and pathetic, whereas Todd is aggressive, demanding, and self-serving. But it's not merely that those traits are viewed as cool by them, but that his treatment of them feels very familiar to the boys. Although we don't know a ton about Beavis and Butthead's families or their home life, what little we do know involves both boys being victims of physical abuse, as well as witnesses to domestic violence on a regular basis. So violence and being treated violently is not only familiar to them, but entirely normalized. This is something they've already been conditioned to accept as an ordinary occurrence and a condition of love, in this sort of this is for your own good type of way, but Beavis and Butthead take it even further. Beavis and Butthead were extremely neglected as young children, and they still are, to the point where neither of their mothers have ever been seen on screen. We only know about them through anecdotes Beavis and Butthead have discussed over the course of the series. Nearly every time they mention their moms, or other family members for that matter, interacting with them in any sort of meaningful way, it is through abuse. So it really isn't any wonder that Beavis and Butthead would go on to seek out this kind of negative attention from people they want to be liked by. And Todd, when not simply annoyed with the two of them, takes full advantage of this. He is perfectly willing to use them for his own gain and quickly discard them, such as the episode Safe House, where Todd hides out at their house from the cops. And of course, as per usual with Todd episodes, receives no comeuppance or punishment at the end of the story. No matter what horrible thing Todd does to them, Butthead will always have the same response.
Todd's cool.
Beavis and Butthead's relationship with Stuart is like the exact mirror to their relationship with Todd. Much like they do with Todd, Stuart looks up to and desperately wants to be friends with the boys. But whereas Beavis and Butthead interpret all of Todd's cruelty as affection, Stuart fools himself into believing Beavis and Butthead are nice to him. This is illustrated perfectly in the episode Beavis and Butthead Are Dead, where we see a memory from Stuart's point of view.
That would be swell.
Yeah, your mom is cool, Stuart.
Oh, you boy. Yeah.
Much like Van Driesen, Stuart could never earn Beavis and Butthead's respect because he's just too much of a wuss. Over the course of the series, Beavis and Butthead have done some nasty things to Stuart. The worst definitely being in Stuart's debut episode, Stuart's House. The boys go over to his place to use his pay-per-view, get bored, and decide to start bullying him instead, and eventually blow up the Stevensons' kitchen. In the episode Kidnapped, Beavis and Butthead get the idea to kidnap Stuart and hold him for ransom to try and raise money for a metal concert. Of course, this mostly just consists of them letting Stuart watch TV while they leave inept messages on his parents' machine. In Stuart is Missing, they lock him in the closet and forget about him, and in Kidney, an adult Beavis is given a kidney transplant from Stuart and intentionally sabotages the kidney because he is so disgusted with the idea of a part of Stuart being inside of him. And those are pretty much the worst things they've ever done to Stuart. Usually their cruelty to Stuart is much milder, such as teasing him for wetting the bed or playing frisbee with his mother's priceless dinner plate. Usually it's just standard name-calling and exclusion. Well, attempts at exclusion, as Stuart never gets the hint that Beavis and Butthead don't want him around. Aside from the aforementioned Stuart's house and a brief instance in an early episode where Butthead pulls Stuart's hair, the two of them don't tend to be physically violent towards Stuart. Certainly nowhere near the degree at which they are with each other. All in all, I guess you're better off worshipping Beavis and Butthead than worshipping Todd. There are other characters Beavis and Butthead interact with on a regular basis, but I feel their relationships with Todd and Stuart speak most to their personality. That's why it really is a shame that Todd and Stuart aren't reoccurring characters in the new seasons, because even though they weren't in every episode, just the implication of their presence in Highland and the fact that you know Beavis and Butthead's dynamic with these two in particular really adds a lot of context to their characters in terms of how they interpret the world and each other. But if there's any two characters who have shaped them most into the characters we see on screen, it would be the characters who have never been seen on screen, their mothers.
Men have feelings too. May I share mine with you? I may softly weep or cry out loud.
So, because neither of their moms have ever been seen, there's a lot we have to infer about them, what kind of people they are, and what they have done or not done. And there are a couple of different ways we can get a picture as to what these two ladies are like. One is from various anecdotes and stories Beavis and Butthead have talked about over the course of the series, mainly in music video segments. Some of the supplemental books give us a few different tidbits, and then of course we can simply observe Beavis and Butthead's lives and their living situation. So let's start with that, since it's probably the easiest. What we do know about their moms is that they were both extremely promiscuous, which neither of the boys deny. In Beavis and Butthead Do the Universe, we find out that Beavis' mother's name is Shirley, and she was the one who owned the house they live in. Now, in the original series, it was made pretty clear that this was meant to be Butthead's house, but since we never do see Beavis' home, and we do see both boys in the house since early childhood, I think it's safe to say they both lived there. And Butthead's mom probably lived there too. Based on what Butthead's dad said in Do America, it seems like their moms were friends, so if they were also roommates in this house, that makes sense. Speaking of their fathers, it's been explicitly stated throughout the series that they have no idea who their fathers are. They do actually meet them in Beavis and Butthead Do America, but neither party ever actually figures this out. We, the audience, are later explicitly told these men are in fact Beavis and Butthead's biological fathers, but they never find that out. Very, very early on, like within the first 5 episodes, Beavis and Butthead mention a father a couple of times. In the episode At the Drive-In, Beavis insults Butthead's dad.
For a good time, call Beavis's mom. 5-5.
Yeah, well, it says here, for a great time, call Butthead's dad.
Gross.
And in the episode Scientific Stuff, Butthead tells Daria he learned the head-knocking trick from his dad.
Everything I know, I learned from my dad.
Yeah, me too.
Really? You both have the same dad?
We're not sure. It's possible.
This was something that Mike Judge was considering early on to perhaps make Beavis and Butthead related, but ultimately he decided against it. Although, if you wanted to work Butthead's comment into canon, you could easily just say that perhaps his mom had a boyfriend at some point who Butthead believed was his father. maybe someone from his early childhood. Interestingly, in Beavis and Butthead Do the Universe, Butthead says his father died of syphilis. To me, I take this to mean this was probably something his mom told him to get him to stop asking. I said we never see their moms. That's, I guess, not entirely true. We do see who I assume is Shirley's hand in the episode The Special One. There's also this trading card right here. Trailer Ladies. It's not stated anywhere on this card that this is meant to be a depiction of Beavis and Butthead's moms, but many fans take it that way or have used this card as inspiration as to what they may look like. This same artwork is used to depict their moms in the book This Book Sucks as part of their family tree. It also says that this one that looks like Butthead is Beavis's mom and this one that looks like Beavis is Butthead's mom. Also, according to this family tree, Beavis and Butthead are both related and also the products of like extreme generational inbreeding, which some of you might say, well, that makes sense, but we know that's not canon, so let's just not worry about that family tree. What we know for certain is that Beavis and Butthead are extremely neglected and have been from an early age. As I said, specifics tend to come up the most during music video segments. Some memorable stories include Beavis's mom trying to abandon him at an IKEA, which led to him being put into foster care for a short time, as well as Shirley's Halloween orgy. Butthead's mom is mentioned far less, so we don't know as much about her. In the episode True Crime, Beavis asks to stay at Butthead's but decides against it after hearing his mom's boyfriend will be there.
Can I sleep at your house tonight?
I don't know. I'll ask my mom's boyfriend.
Never mind.
And yeah, I know that also throws a wrench into my whole they live together theory, but I'm not the one who wrote it as Butthead's house for like 30 years and then randomly decided, oh, actually it should be Beavis's house, okay? I'm just the one who's trying to make it all make sense. But this does raise an interesting point as to why Beavis didn't want to be around this boyfriend. Was it just too awkward? Was this guy a little creepy or something more sinister? I'll leave that to you in the comments to decide. Whoever has the most insightful or creative theory, I'll pin to the top of this video. But it's clear that the neglect and abuse they've experienced has affected their personalities and the ways in which they interact with the world around them. For example, age-inappropriate behavior and developmental delay. In many ways, Beavis and Butthead are typical teenagers, but in many ways they're not. They lag far behind their peers in academics, and that isn't just because they're slackers. They're both confirmed as having brain damage in the episode of The Good Deed. People tend to think of brain damage as something caused by physical trauma to the brain, but it can also be caused by emotional trauma in formative years, neglect, and lack of nutrition. Beavis and Butthead are both emotionally stunted and often exhibit behavior typical of much younger children than 15. Some examples include playing with toys and playing make-believe. Their perceptions of themselves and how they relate to the world around them is more typical of very young children, such as lack of understanding of pain, lack of understanding of the concept of death, lack of understanding of natural consequences, all things I talked about above. I don't think it's ever been explicitly stated, although it has been implied that Beavis and Butthead's mothers physically abused them. For example, in the episode Sprout, the boys yell at and threaten physical violence on the plant, clearly imitating how they themselves were parented. Beavis does this again in the episode Beekeepers. There have been more adverse experiences Beavis and Butthead have suffered, such as humiliation, for example in the episodes Sporting Goods and Wet Behind the Rears. They've also suffered sexual abuse, which I wasn't sure if I wanted to talk about in this video. Ultimately, I had written it without this in there, and I just felt like it was something that should be mentioned. I understand if you don't want to watch this section of the video. I'm not gonna go like into too much detail, but if you don't want to watch this section, you can just skip to this timestamp on the screen. But yeah, I felt it was a bit incomplete if I didn't mention these experiences. So I'm just gonna do it now.
And I just want to say that I'm not by any means suggesting that these things are put in here to make you feel sad or to be really dark and dramatic, but they did intentionally write this to be a part of the characters and what makes them who they are.
Even from the very first episode, Door to Door, Beavis and Butthead have an unpleasant and equally unconsensual encounter with an elderly dominatrix named Cora Anthrax. She even goes on to taunt them by writing a letter to Van Driesen, which he unwittingly reads out loud, further humiliating the two. She would reappear a couple of times in the comics, exhibiting equally disturbing behavior.
Yeah, he turned his chair backwards and rolled up his sleeves.
You know, he invited me over to his apartment for spaghetti, too.
That's kind of weird. You didn't go, did you?
Maybe, I don't really remember. He gave me some lemonade, and then the next thing I remember, I woke up under a bridge.
You never told me about this.
As Beavis describes his experience, it's clear he doesn't really understand what happened to him. Butthead, on the other hand, has been shown to be extremely good at recognizing signs of grooming by adults and understands when an adult is behaving inappropriately. For example, when Beavis told Butthead about Rick, Butthead was immediately put off when he learned Rick had invited Beavis to his house. As Beavis continues, Butthead is able to understand what really happened, even though Beavis doesn't. Notoriously, in issue 26 of the comics, Beavis and Butthead are picked up by Todd and Earl in Todd's car, and I'm sure just by looking at the comic panels you can tell what is being heavily implied here. And if you're thinking I'm reading too much into this, well, that's the name of the game. That's kind of what we're doing here. Kind of no point to the video if I'm not overanalyzing everything. These are only just a few of the experiences we've seen or heard discussed, and these incidents could explain a lot of their behavior. For example, their refusal to undress in the locker room in the episode Wet Behind the Rears, if you want to put a really sad context behind that episode for no reason. Just one of the many common symptoms of this type of abuse that the boys do in fact exhibit. Others being anger and aggression, clinginess, in particular to each other, drug abuse, their habit of seeking inappropriate partners. They hit on adults much more than their own peers, and not even necessarily especially attractive adult women either. In Do the Universe, it is revealed that Butthead has a fear of sex being painful.
Did it hurt?
Nope. And I was never worried that it would.
Okay, we're done with the super dark stuff now. I just felt that I had to mention it because there are a lot of connections you can make once you start piecing all of those things together, and because of the fact that they have talked about this in detail more than a couple times, I felt that it is something that is intentionally written into their character. But let's lighten things up. In a video about the psychology of Beavis and Butthead, we obviously have to talk about what I'm sure was on everyone's mind when they clicked on this video: cornholio. Cornholio is Beavis's alter ego, a bizarre character he becomes when he has too much caffeine or sugar. There are a lot of fan theories online having to do with this persona. Usually these have to do with ideas that Beavis is being possessed or perhaps some form of split personality disorder, and I see a lot of attempts at explaining what his little catchphrases and repeated phrases really mean. I need TP for my bunghole, his Spanish accent he takes on. If you look at the first Cornholio episode, The Great Cornholio, you can actually see pretty definitely where some of these things come from. At the beginning of the episode, Beavis and Butthead go over to Stuart's house because he has diarrhea. Stuart's mom says she's going to take Stuart some TP. During class, when Beavis has his first freakout, Mr. Van Driesen is listing Latin American countries, pronouncing them with an accent. When Beavis leaves class, he wanders into a Spanish class. Beavis and Butthead also first pulled their shirts up over their heads in the episode Generation in Crisis.
I am the great Cornholio. I come from Lake Titicaca.
That's cool.
It seems to me pretty obvious that Beavis is just repeating words and phrases he's heard before, which he has a tendency to do. One example would be that whenever he says thank you, he says, "Thank you, drive through," a phrase he obviously learned working at Burger World. Another thing I see a lot of people online bring up is the question of if Beavis can remember what he's done while in Cornholio mode, or if he has control over himself. Obviously, he is on a sugar high, he is kind of following these bizarre impulses, but he does that normally. It's just that now he has even stranger impulses, and he's even more hyper. There's also 2 instances in Do America where he clearly breaks character, if you will, which seems to me pretty definite that he is in control of himself. It's more that he's on such a high he doesn't care or think about the consequences of his actions. I mean, like, even more than usual. Also interesting to note, despite how iconic Cornholio is, he only appeared in 4 episodes of the original series. In the season 9 episode Nice Butthead, Butthead is prescribed mood-stabilizing pills, which are supposed to repress his aggression. He becomes kind of addicted to them, which causes his personality to change. He becomes not just less aggressive, but more considerate, patient, studious, and overall seems happier. Beavis, of course, cannot stand this version of Butthead, which I've talked about. Eventually, he snaps, attacks Butthead, and forces him to vomit up all the pills, returning him to his normal self. 2 things I want to talk about in regard to this episode are Butthead's changes and Beavis's reaction to it. Butthead starts caring about his best friend, caring about school, caring about Van Driesen, even his fashion sense changes, all from supposedly being less aggressive. Now, obviously, as the episode makes clear, Butthead is popping these pills like crazy, taking way more than he's supposed to, but it still kind of begs the question, is so much of Butthead's personality really linked to his aggression? Does everything draw back to his anger, even his disinterest in school? Maybe he's just really high off these pills. Even more interesting, I think, than the idea that Butthead would be this person if he just didn't experience anger is Beavis's reaction to it. This and the Christmas episode are 2 things that make me just not understand at all the people who say Beavis would be happier without Butthead, or even that they want Butthead written out of the show. Over the course of the episode, Beavis finds himself hating the new Butthead more and more. Nice Butthead is no longer fun, he doesn't want to goof off or get into trouble, he invites Van Driesen to have lunch with him, and he never challenges Beavis at all, simply wanting to comply with his wishes, do whatever he wants to do. Beavis cannot stand it. He wants Butthead to push back, he wants him to be fun and interesting, he doesn't want him to be nice and caring. When he manages to get the pills out of Butthead's system, Butthead is immediately angry at him, which Beavis is overjoyed by, as I've said. He's even happier when Butthead slams his head into a wall. This is exactly the Butthead he wants. He loves it. Just like Butthead would be willing to take Beavis away from his supposedly better life, where he was beloved and an asset to the community, simply for Butthead's own happiness, Beavis would do the same. He would take Butthead from a place where he feels happier and has more of a chance at a future, simply to have the friend he knows back. Beavis does not want a nice Butthead. So that is my video on the psychology of Beavis and Butthead. So leave your thoughts in the comments below if you have any suggestions for future videos, and please don't forget to subscribe, and I will see you all in the next video. Bye!